Great. Welcome, everyone. I think we'll get going on our second day of the conference. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome and to introduce Tim Behringer, who will be giving this morning's keynote. So, Tim, as all of you will know, is not only one of our very best art historians, but really one of the leading scholars of the visual arts in Victorian Britain and in 19th century America. And he's not only written and edited seminal books such as the prize-winning Men at Work, Art and Labour in Victorian Britain of 2006, and Art in the British Empire of 2007, which he co-edited with Jeff Quilley and Douglas Fordham. But he's also curated a series of major exhibitions, and when you look over that list over time, it's pretty remarkable. Those include American Sublime, landscape painting in the United States, 1825 to 1880, which took place at Tate Britain in 2002. Art and Emancipation in Jamaica, which took place at the Yale Center in 2007 as one of many collaborations that Tim has worked on with the Yale Center for British Art. And of course, Pre-Raphaelites, Victorian Avant-Garde, which opened at Tate Britain in 2012 and then went on an astonishing journey to Washington, Moscow, Tokyo, and Turin. Furthermore, yet another major and amazing show is on the horizon. Thomas Cole's Journey, Atlantic Crossings, opens at the Met in January, this coming January, before then coming to the National Gallery here in London in the summer. So that's a really exciting show to look forward to. And at the same time as that show is taking place, Tim has been involved with a collective of art historians at Yale, organising another parallel exhibition, which is actually taking place at Thomas Cole's house in the Catskills, which is called The Picturesque and the Sublime. And in 2009, Tim was the Slade Professor at Cambridge, where he gave a great series of lectures on the topic of broken music, or broken pastoral. Yeah. Art and music, or art and the pastoral in Britain. No, I won't get it even more confused. So let me just say it one more time. Broken pastoral, art and music in Britain, Gothic revival to punk rock. And it's a book that we're all looking forward to reading when it comes out. And as I mentioned yesterday, he's going to be giving the Paul Mellon lectures, again here in London and again in Yale, in the spring of 2019 on the topic of global landscape. So all of this, of course, is hugely impressive, but I think we really have to mark this moment by saying that what's also remarkable about Tim is the quality and the impact of his teaching. And quite simply, he's helped turn the Yale History of Art department into one of the world's most exciting places to study British art, and into a pioneering centre of scholarship on the topic of the relationship between British art and the British Empire. During his time at New Haven, Tim has taught and mentored a host of exceptionally talented graduate students, many of whom have gone on to leading jobs in the discipline, and all of whom, when you talk to them, testify to his wonderful guidance, to his liveliness and his interest, his enthusiasm, and his intellectual energy, and above all, his willingness to take them on far-flung field trips all across the world.
No expense.
At no expense, indeed. And in this process, he's had a huge and hugely positive influence on our field as a whole. So much of what we today take for granted in relation to British art history, particularly in terms of its exploration of themes of empire and of cross-cultural artistic exchange, has been profoundly shaped by Tim's thinking and teaching. So it's a special treat, Tim, to have managed to pull you away from your onerous duties as chair of the department at Yale and to bring you to London. Given all your recent research on the landscape painting, we were really keen for you to come. So we very much look forward to hearing your talk on Thomas Cole's Journey, the White Atlantic. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. That's a very moving and a really wonderful introduction. And it's also a great honor to speak in this room. I want to thank the organizing troika of institutions, which is a great collaboration. But it's also great to speak in a room with so many people who influenced my own thinking when I was starting thinking about landscape, and also who've actually already published many of the ideas that I'm going to give as my own today. So I particularly want to thank Steve Daniels, who's here somewhere, and Michael Rosenthal, who will recognize the imprint of their own work on what I've been trying to say about Thomas Cole. We had a superb day of papers yesterday. It was really one of the best days of conference I've been to for many, many years. And I want to acknowledge how much I've learned from my colleagues at Yale, Martina Droth, Amy Myers, and all of my departmental colleagues, especially Jennifer Raab, the professor of American art, who really specializes in this material. But most of all, picking up on what Mark just said from the students, it's normally the case that the professor actually instructs the students, but at Yale it's the other way around. You actually learn more from people like Julia Lum, who gave such an extraordinary talk yesterday, and her cohort of wonderful contemporaries. So the only other thing I'd like to say before I start is that every image that I show today, I think with a couple of exceptions, will be in the exhibition that's coming to London in the summer, so you can see the real thing, and the full caption material is available on the Met's website, so I haven't put little titles under everything. The only thing that is not coming is the Borghese Gladiator, which is in Rome, and it's in the Louvre, and it's not coming. But apart from that, we've got everything. Without further ado, let me introduce you to the galleries of American painting and sculpture at the Metropolitan Museum, a sacred space in which landscape paintings act as icons of the nation. Two redoubtable ladies of the Gilded Age frame the long vista, and we move through the enfilade of galleries as if processing through a cathedral, heading inexorably towards the altar. And there, enshrined by architecture, but also clad in its original frame made in New York in 1836, is Thomas Cole's view from Mount Holyoke, Northampton, Massachusetts, after a thunderstorm, known as the Oxbow of 1836. It stands as a cherished emblem of American art. Acquired by the Metropolitan Museum in 1908, this work has become iconic. Identified, there it is closer up, and we'll look at it some more. Identified in 1986 as a vision of an American paradise, it has attained the status of a pure emanation of national identity. If we look closely at the foreground there, we can discern a small figure, the figure of the artist, Thomas Cole. He's been working for some time, sketching the view before him with bold strokes of oil paint upon a canvas propped up on a portable easel. He turns away from his work for a moment, and we confront him face to face, his hand poised in mid-air, holding a brush loaded with fresh yellow paint. If the figure of Cole is modest in size, the scale of his ambition and of his achievement are apparent in the magnificent vista that surrounds him. His oil sketch has been transformed in the studio into a grand composition offering a gazetteer of the glories of American scenery, in which the epic of modern history is being played out before our eyes. To the left, the untamed and pristine wilderness of the mountaintop, its roiling green foliage spilling down a bold diagonal path across the canvas, with storm cloud majestic above. In the distance, a great river winds through fertile grasslands recently brought under cultivation. The forests have been cleared, and modern civilization has transformed the landscape. To the left, wilderness, volatility, and natural splendor. Before us, the young citizens of the industrious republic engage, the industrious citizens of the young republic, could be both, engage in the pursuit of personal and national destiny. The artist is poised at a fulcrum, at the meeting point of nature industrialization, past and present, sublime and picturesque. And after yesterday's discussion, I would say to the left of Thomas Cole, the Anthropocene, and to the right, whatever it was that went before that. These binaries structured Thomas Cole's life experience and shaped his artistic vision. And I shall claim today that they're also fundamental to landscape painting as a genre. I proposed Thomas Cole as a paradigmatic figure today at the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art because he has until now had no place whatever in the study of British art, but has existed rather in an entirely separate discursive space. He's habitually referred to as the father of American landscape painting, or the father of the Hudson River School, which is a magnificently spurious entity beloved of American scholars and their public, which has no historical existence whatever. This allegedly protean, even priapic role, I shall argue, has led to a total misreading of Cole's work, to a misreading that is symptomatic of a wider problem in discourses about landscape, where nation remains the key defining concept. After his death at the age of 47 in 1848, Cole's friend, the poet William Cullen Bryant, eulogized his departed artist friend as unmistakably American. Here they are seen together in Asher Brown Duran's memorial painting, Kindred Spirits. Cole stands with Bryant among the glorious scenery of Catskill Clove near Catskill, New York. When this painting recently was sold by the public collection at the New York Public Library to the private collection of the owner of Walmart, Alice Walton, but then placed in her private museum in Arkansas, it caused a significant controversy, indicating the status of this work as a benchmark of national identity. And I'm very glad to say that the museum, Crystal Bridges, is very graciously lending the work to our show, so you can see it in London this summer. Cole's name, along with that of Bryant, is carved into a tree trunk in the lower left-hand corner of the composition, suggesting not only a kind of rural vandalism with which we're all too familiar, but also an organic connection between these two men and the Hudson Valley, a place beneath the bark of American civilization. For decades, Cole was celebrated thus as a progenitor, even though his work seemed soon to belong to a past era. Henry Kirk Brown's posthumous marble bust was made actually from a daguerreotype by Matthew Brady after Cole's death, obviously, and the two objects together suggest Cole's presence on the very threshold of American modernity, an insistently contemporary medium, the daguerreotype, serving as a model for an ancient form, the portrait bust. And, of course, the comb-over remains a deeply regrettable art historical phenomenon at any period in history, but there we are. That's just Tom Cole for you. Cole's reputation disappeared into obscurity after his death, but emerged again in the 1960s in the work of excellent scholars such as Alan Wallach and Angela Miller, where he's returned as a subject of serious scholarship almost unknown, unfortunately, though, outside the United States. And there is a significant problem with this historiography, because it tends to neglect, and the enshrining of his work at the Met underpins this, it tends to neglect what I believe is a key fact, that Thomas Cole was born in Bolton, Lancashire in 1801, the son of a strikingly unsuccessful textile entrepreneur in the early years of the Industrial Revolution. And this superb lithograph, to which I'll return repeatedly because it's one of my favorite objects in the history of art, represents the town in 1848, the year of Cole's death, in fact. The simple fact of Cole's origin demands a repositioning of this artist, which might also recast him not as the creator of American landscape painting ex nihilo, but as an embodiment of a transatlantic exchange imbricated in visual and cultural traditions from Europe, but also profoundly responsive to the natural and cultural changes that were taking place both in the Old World and the New World at the time he lived. He is, in short, a hybrid figure. In celebrated writings, Paul Gilroy and Joseph Roach have identified the Black Atlantic as a space of cultural and performative exchange, one that connected London and New Orleans, Kingston, Jamaica, with the ports of the Ivory Coast and with the mainland of Great Britain and the United States. The African-American experience of the Atlantic world remains absolutely unique, marked as such by the incomparable trauma of chattel slavery, and I don't want to say anything that in any way challenges that. But the transregional circulatory model developed in African-American studies in the Black Atlantic might be used, I think, to offer a new account of American art as a whole, in which the narrative becomes one of syncretism and hybridity, one of exchange, rather than an exceptionalist celebration of difference from a European norm, which deals in center and periphery arguments wherever you place the center and wherever you place the periphery. To see American art, there it is, as one node within the flux of an Atlantic world, rather than as an emanation of a national consciousness, better accounts for the complex allegiances and deep ambivalences of Thomas Cole's landscape paintings. Such a view might transform him from being an important North American painter into being a global figure. And perhaps we might use the term white Atlantic, for want of a better one, to indicate the way in which circulation across these spaces took place. The white Atlantic has a history which has not yet emerged, although I pay tribute to Jennifer Roberts for opening up this space with her own work. So rooted is nationalism within the very fabric of our discipline and its institutions. Cole, I want to argue today, drew on his experience of life and his observation of historical processes on two continents, utilizing landscape painting as a site for the analysis and critique of industrial modernity at the very moment of its formation. And I should say now, this paper is a result of two collaborations, as Mark has already kindly suggested. One between myself as a historian of British art, the art of the British Empire, with the curator of these galleries, the curator of American paintings and sculpture at the Metropolitan Museum, Betsy Kornhauser. That collaboration will result in this exhibition shown at the Met and the National Gallery, Thomas Cole's Journey. But the other one, which has been formative for me, has been working with Jennifer Raab, Gillian Forrester, and two Yale grad students, Sophie Linford and Nick Robbins, to rethink the impact of British print culture on Thomas Cole and his generation. And that's the exhibition Picturesque and Sublime, which will be at Thomas Cole's house. So what I present today is the result of conversations between groups rather than a sort of solo effort. We want to rethink Thomas Cole as an unmoored figure, trans-regional, transnational, whose complex journeys back and forth in life and art unsettle nationalist conceptions. And by putting British and American paintings in the same place, it seems so obvious, it very rarely happens, the same physical space, these exhibitions force a reassessment of Atlantic exchange as a visual and cultural phenomenon, and raise significant issues around the relationship of landscape ecology and cultural identity, which are urgently present in the political world today. But I want to begin by putting Sarah Turner and Amy Concannon at home, because we have two Lancastrians in the room, and I want to acknowledge that, and we'll get to the reasons why in about 30 seconds, by showing them a spurious photograph of Bolton in 1900. The reason I do this is to indicate that the geography from which Thomas Cole came was one of deep valleys with industrial factories and intense urbanization, and then moorland landscapes surrounding them, wild moorland landscapes. This is a photograph from about 1900. And this interaction between industry in the valley and then a natural world in the highlands around was celebrated first in a painting memorably discussed by Steve Daniels, Leeds, by J.M.W. Turner, watercolor of 1816. It's really this landscape setting that Turner encapsulates so brilliantly that Cole emerged from. Cole was a boy of 15 when this was painted, living only 45 miles away. This is Leeds, however, and I wanted to get Yorkshire into this just because that's where I come from, just to show that it exists. The towns, in fact, were connected by turnpike roads, such as that you can see in the right foreground. And like Bolton, Leeds was packed tight with factories, workshops, and terrace houses. It lies in the valley with moorland beyond, where industrial smoke and the natural cloud cover blend inextricably together. And Turner asks us to muse on a profound question without, in this image, I think, offering us an answer. Do we see before us here in 1816 a providential turn of events among a chosen people, a vision of progress itself? Or is the Industrial Revolution emerging in front of Turner's eyes nothing but a blackening of England's pristine countryside, a debasement of its once proud rural populace? What is the meaning of these figures in the foreground of Turner's works? Before ever he set foot in America, Thomas Cole had witnessed these questions playing themselves out in the north of England. They would preoccupy him for the rest of his life, transposed to the New World. In the United States, these processes of historical transformation would be even more violent. Starting later, they moved faster, more fearsome in their environmental ravages, whose results are all too visible today. The center of Bolton, where Cole's family lived, this map of 1824 shows it quite well, was dense with alleyways and yards. Overcrowding was endemic, sanitation terrible, disease rampant, the supply of fresh water limited and compromised. And this fantastic chromolithograph made from the top of a factory chimney by an artist called Selim Rothwell and then reproduced and widely circulated in chromo form gives a sense of the town as it was when Friedrich Engels described it with some sarcasm as the masterwork of English manufacture. So when Thomas... No, let's go in closer because I just love this image so much. There we are. When Thomas Cole was baptized in the independent Protestant Duke's Alley Chapel, the baby was carried outside and would have seen a sawmill, a flax mill, a graveyard, and this foundry. They were right outside where he was baptized. Central to the town's economy was the making of cotton cloth. Bolton's damp, cool climate is ideal for spinning and weaving, and the town holds a special place in the history of industrialization as the home of Samuel Crompton, inventor of the mule, a technological innovation allowing weaving to move from domestic to factory production. At the time of Cole's childhood, these exact manufacturing techniques were suddenly displacing whole categories of the traditional skilled labor force, causing occupational groups to be cast suddenly from prosperity to poverty. And early in 1811, while Cole was a child in Bolton, the government in London received petitions from the town complaining of high food prices and wages that, quote, scarcely afford the necessaries of life, and predicting fearful violence. The following year, unrest broke out under the banner of Luddism, an anti-industrial movement responsible for campaigns of arson and machine breaking aimed at the protection of traditional rights and privileges of the manual laborer. Bolton became the focus of national attention in April 1812, when on the outskirts of the town, the West Horton Mill, within yards of a small weaving business run by Cole's cousin, John Pendlebury, was burned to the ground because weaving by steam had forced the local handloom weavers into poverty. Scenes of the apocalyptic sublime, the inferno of this burning factory that was remembered for years in Bolton, still being written about in the local paper in 1885, surely, I think, would remain in Cole's mind and would preoccupy him in some of his finest works. The mythical leader of the movement, Captain Ned Ludd, appeared in a hostile caricature. Is this political? Some kind of political intervention here. There we are. Wait till later, you'll find it even worse. Appeared in a hostile caricature based directly on the West Horton Mill incident, and there's only one surviving copy of this in the British Museum. It'll be in the show. Once again, we see the high moors behind an industrial scene in the valley below. But this time, the town is in flames. If we look more closely at the image, we see militiamen in hot pursuit in blue jackets. But towering over the whole scene is the bizarre figure of Ned Ludd himself, clad in a calico dress made from the cheap, brightly colored printed cotton textiles made in the mill. The intention, of course, was to ridicule and effeminize Ludd and his army by linking rebellious textile workmen to the female consumers of the fabrics they produced. But the effect of the print is menacing indeed. The face of a neglected industrial underclass bent on revenge. The middle-class Cole family belonged to the dissenting traditions of Protestantism, and in the flames of the Luddite rebellion, many saw signs of the end of the world, or at least the cyclical destruction of evil empires, as described in the Old Testament, a theme to which Cole would return a quarter of a century later. And doubtless the hellfire and brimstone sermons he heard on a Sunday morning would have drawn parallels with scenes of damnation, such as Belshazzar's Feast, a narrative painted by Cole's contemporary John Martin, the picture now in the Yale Center for British Art, also a dissenter, also from an industrial city. This work and another, and both will be in the exhibition together, de Lutherbourg's demonic vision of Colebrookdale at night, there's another nod to Steve Daniels for a brilliant article on this, these kind of images underline the relational continuity between industrial flames and the flames of hell. Now, when Thomas Cole's father, urbane and impractical, failed to make his fortune as a textile manufacturer, the family found themselves on the verge of poverty, and the young Thomas in 1815 found himself working in Chorley as an engraver, carving wood patterns into the blocks that would be used for printing patterns on calicos. He was, in short, a factory labourer. Although we know nothing of Cole's personal work in the factory, its products likely resembled these. And it's worth noting that the raw cotton was the product, of course, of the slave economy of the southern states of the US, where he would end up living, and the vividly colored geometric block-printed designs of the calicos derive from Indian textiles imported to London through the mercantile networks of the East India Company. So in the fastness of provincial Lancashire at 14, Cole was already enmeshed in global networks of trade and empire. And again, he could watch the painful progress of history. The innovations of Robert Peel, the grandfather of the future Prime Minister, known as Parsley Peel, for reasons I can talk about later, near Bolton in 1810. We're looking at his Robert Peel's order book of 1810 here, transformed calico printing from a hand technique for highly skilled to a machine technology, rendering yet another group of skilled labourers, the printers, redundant. According to a highly romanticized biography written after his death, the young Cole, a solitary youth, would escape when his work ended in the factory and climb high into the local moorlands, whose power over the romantic imagination is so clear. Think of Wuthering Heights. But a closer literary analogue is found in John Keats's seventh sonnet of 1817, the work of a young man born only 6 years before Thomas Cole. O solitude, if I must with thee dwell, let it not be among the jumbled heap of murky buildings. Climb with me to the steep, nature's observatory, whence the dell, its flowery slopes, its rivers crystal swell, may seem a span. Let me thy vigils keep amongst boughs pavilioned, where the deer's swift leap startles the wild bee from the foxglove bell. It's worth saying the phrase kindred spirits, which was used for Durand's portrait of Cole posthumously, is also from this same poem. It seems to me that Cole's entire creative output, his self-narration, his project, was structured by this fundamental trope to withdraw from murky buildings into nature amongst boughs pavilioned. The binary of wild versus cultivated, timeless versus modern, is of course the underlying structure of the oxbow, and again I want to stress a structuring trope of landscape as a genre of representation. A short journey then took the impecunious family to Liverpool, where Cole at 16 became an apprentice in an engraver's shop, and there surely he became immersed in the print culture of the period. Through engravings, aquatints, and mezzotints, he had the opportunity, we believe, can't prove it, to absorb the main compositional tropes and expressive effects of English landscape art of the period, such as this work by Paul Sandby. And I think Sandby is significant here because as the engraver of a major pre-revolutionary and pan-imperial collection, the Scenographica Americana, Sandby played an inaugural role in the creation of an American picturesque. But it was his travels to Wales which produced 3 volumes of refined aquatints that I think provided the armchair traveller with a kind of visual treatise on landscape aesthetics by laying out a wide range of possible compositional tropes. And I'm showing you Llangollen in the county of Denbigh from 1776. Such prints could certainly be purchased across the British Empire and were widely available in New York City. And this example is notable for the dramatic bulk of a hillside to the right, crowned with sunlight bursting through clouds, distant mountains with rising mists, shimmering water in the foreground. And whether Cole absorbed it from this particular source or one of the myriad other sets of picturesque prints, it seems to me that these were the compositional devices that were taken by Cole across the Atlantic. Indeed, it can be argued that British topographical prints taught Thomas Cole how to see the Hudson Valley. And so to his most important journey from Liverpool to Philadelphia, where the family arrived in 1818, and Cole again was apprenticed to an engraver. But in Philadelphia, he probably encountered landscape paintings, maybe for the first time. These would be by another recent immigrant from England, Joshua Shaw, who exhibited at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, where we know Cole could have seen his work. Trained in London and Bath, Shaw understood the conventions of the topographical view. This is typical of his rather formulaic work, a work of 1819, one of his first American paintings, recently acquired by the Met. And Shaw published a series of picturesque views of American scenery, in which he declared in the preface, asserting his newfound identity — Shaw had only been there a couple of years — that our country, the United States, abounds with scenery comprehending all the varieties of the sublime, the beautiful, and the picturesque in nature. The vast regions of the Republic present to the eye a wild grandeur unsurpassed by any of the boasted scenery of any other country. Now, the picturesque views that are made expertly after Shaw's designs by John Hill, another expat, in fact show none of that. It's an entirely generic scene. It would be very, very difficult to say that wasn't in Gloucestershire, although I may be wrong. But it seems to me that this is anodyne, formulaic work, and it was left to Cole to fulfill the larger project announced in Picturesque Views of American Scenery, to create a distinctive American mode of landscape painting. In 1823, Cole began his transformation from artisan to artist, and a sketchbook gives a sense of his dilemma. The patches of color you see here are trials of natural dyes like hickory with lime water and alum, to be used in his father's latest doomed venture, a floorcloth manufactory. But from the same period comes this extraordinary drawing depicting a tree stump, its gnarled torso strangely animated, its roots uncovered, uncannily suggesting a human form in prefiguration of those blasted trees that are such a tragic protagonist on the left of the oxbow. Cole's energetic penwork seems to conjure up three-dimensionality, with calligraphic lines moving in disciplined parallel, the hallmark of a hand trained in reproductive engraving. Cole once again witnessed a scene of radical economic and social transformation when he arrived in New York City in 1825. On the 25th of October that year, the Erie Canal opened, linking the Hudson River with Lake Erie and ensuring that New York, not Philadelphia or Boston, became the nation's preeminent economic center, providing an nexus between the Midwest, the Northeast, and the rest of the world. Its newfound energy can be seen in this aquatint of South Street by another British expatriate artist, William Bennett. The Hudson is now a great commercial artery, regularly plied by steamships. And the Hudson Highlands nearby had for decades been celebrated in literature, but the visual arts had done nothing with them until in the early 1820s, another ambitious print series, the Hudson River Portfolio, was begun by the artist William Guy Wall. Recently arrived from Ireland, this artist represented an ambitious grafting of American landscape into the familiar formulae of the British picturesque. But it's what Thomas Cole did next that is really interesting. In 1825, he made his first annual pilgrimage to the Hudson Highlands and the Catskill Mountains and produced a group of works that indicate a sudden and unexpected artistic transformation. To take one example, here it is. I'll describe it. Catskill Falls is an astonishingly radical image, confronting the viewer with horizontal bands of rock and a brilliant shock of unmistakably American fall foliage in its full chromatic richness. The water falls slightly off-center, pounding the rock with explosive force. Turbulence is also stirring in the clouds above. There's no peaceful resolution of the vista, as in a traditional landscape painting. Our eye is arrested. Our gaze stops dead in its tracks. And after comprehending the vastness of the scene, the viewer, and I'm sorry for those of you over there, you can see right in the middle the tiny figure of a Native American, a poignant symbol both of a long-established culture and of its banishment from these hereditary lands. There were no such people left in Catskill, New York at this time, and a uniquely American presence which has no analog in European landscape painting. But while this spurious sign of persisting indigeneity is problematic, but nonetheless present, Cole carefully removed all the signifiers of settler colonialism, such as the viewing platform and the guest house that were clearly visible from this position at the already famous tourist spot of Catskill Falls in 1826. After 4 years of mounting success in New York City, Cole made a significant choice: to return to Europe on a grand tour, first to the center of modern landscape painting, London, and to the traditional heartland of European culture in Rome. This was his second Atlantic crossing, and one which surely portended both a historiographic, a critical, and perhaps a psychic crisis, as well as offering huge potential professional dividends. Cole's friend Bryant was worried that the artist, after only a decade in the New World, might forsake it altogether, and wrote this poem: "Thine eyes shall see the light of distant skies, yet Cole, thy heart shall bear to Europe's strand a living image of thy native land, such as on thy own glorious canvas lies. Lone lakes, savannas where the bison roves, rocks rich with summer garlands, solemn streams, skies where the desert eagle wheels and screams, spring bloom and autumn blaze of boundless groves. Fair scenes shall greet thee where thou goest, fair but different. Everywhere the trace of men, paths, homes, graves, ruins from the lowest glen to where life shrinks from the fierce alpine air. Gaze on them till the tears shall dim thy sight, but keep that earlier, wilder image bright." Bryant is struggling to inscribe Cole within a discourse of American exceptionalism. But of course, he's using the language of English Romantic poetry to do so. He's trying to tie the artist's powers to the distinctive identity of the American landscape. But Cole left for Europe in the summer of 1829, just over a decade after first arriving. He came to Portsmouth, took a post-chase to London, and like all of us, he was there on the last day of the Royal Academy's summer exhibition. So like everyone in this room, he was there on the last day of the show, and he said, "I want to be in time to see the exhibition at Somerset House." He hurried to London and was able to see one painting which I believe had a transformational effect on his oeuvre, and that was John Constable's great Hadley Castle, which will be shown in the exhibition for the first time alongside Cole's own work. The motif of its ruinous tower, symbolic both of personal and societal collapse, as Michael Rosenthal has taught us, haunted Cole for the rest of his life. Constable's painting a meditation on what he saw as the shattering of traditional English values and virtues in the hands of townsmen and liberals with the onset of democracy deeply affected Cole. His later work is full of, sometimes, as in this case, rather unfortunate, but nonetheless full of paraphrases of this idea of the tower as a kind of metaphor for personal and social tragedy. But there was, of course, a bigger beast in the London art world. That day, 29th of June, at the Royal Academy, Cole jotted down excited sketches of Ulysses deriding Polyphemus by J.M.W. Turner, writing underneath his sketch, "Turner," as if the thing could be by anyone else. Cole was clearly impressed he then followed up this experience by presenting himself on the 12th of December, 1829, to Turner's private gallery on Queen Anne Street. Cole was clearly impressed by one work in particular, which he continued to reference in attempted emulation throughout his career, the massive snowstorm Hannibal and his army crossing the Alps. Cole referred to it in his notebook as a sublime picture with a powerful effect of chiaroscuro. But the visit was not altogether a success. Cole wrote, "I had expected to see an older man with a countenance pale with thought. But I was entirely mistaken. He has a common form and a common countenance, and there's nothing in his appearance or conversation indicative of genius. He looks like a seafaring man, a mate of a coastal vessel, and his manners were in accordance with his appearance. I can scarcely reconcile my mind to the idea that he painted those grand pictures. And of course, we know what Turner was like because we've all seen Timothy Spall in Mike Leigh's brilliant film, so probably Cole might have been a bit right. But Turner's work moved far beyond the range of Cole's conservative imagining. Rocks should not look like sugar candy, nor the ground look like jelly, Cole grumbled into his notebook, even as he desperately emulated Turner in his own sketches, as you can see. Cole also took the opportunity to visit the great collections of London, seeing for the first time old masters. There were none in New York at this time on public show, visiting the Dulwich Picture Gallery, certainly the new National Gallery housed in the Pall Mall residence of John Joseph Angerstein, where Cole absorbed the influence of Claude Lorrain for the first time from paintings. He'd seen, of course, many prints, carefully noting the mill and the seaport as great exemplary works. And amazingly, his annotated thumbed copy of Otley's Guide to the Gallery survives as a great source. Like all artists of his day, he paid homage to the Parthenon sculptures, that's Cole's drawing, the famous Elgin marbles installed at the British Museum since 1817, to attempt to make up for the academic art education he lacked. But London also offered other seductions for the eye, which would be significant for Cole, such as Burford's panorama in Leicester Square. And somewhere in relation to that more popular image-making is the artist John Martin, who could inhabit a position between elite and popular culture, employing the vocabulary of the apocalyptic sublime, and I think Martin Myrone is here, who did a wonderful exhibition of Martin recently, which drew these ideas out, to articulate biblical tales, Joshua commanding the sun to stand still, for example, for a mass audience. And this was a role that Cole himself undoubtedly coveted. He also turned his attention to the landscapes of the land in which he'd been born. He went to the Lake District, stopping in Lancashire on the way, noting the familiar outline of the Langdale Pikes. He drew windmills at Nottingham, but turned his back on the town's modern textile industry. He toyed with a view of London from Regent's Park, and he was particularly interested in the ancestral home of Lord Byron, Newstead Abbey. He admired Byron's poetry and shared his romantic fascination for the great arcs of historical rise and fall. This stormy vision of Byron's home, which formed the basis for a lost oil painting executed in London, will be in the drawing will be in the exhibition, the wash drawing. But Atlantic circulation was freighted still for Cole with a logic of centre and periphery. The British art world treated him with disdain. He keenly noted the instructions for submitting work to the British institution and pulled out all the stops, creating the grandest picture I have ever painted, a tornado in the wilderness, another precursor to the oxbow, very clearly, but also a kind of echo of a work he'd seen by Salvatore Rosa, known as Augures. But Cole was trying too hard, and the picture was, this is the wrong installation, but just to give the sense of how a painting could be skied, it was skied desperately at the Society of British Artists, an insult Cole never forgot, and the work remained unsold. But Cole made a key acquaintance, that of John Constable. He almost certainly visited the older artist's London studio, only minutes away from his own modest digs, and there he saw Constable's oil sketches, private works that achieved celebrity only really a century later. These dramatically expressive sketches in which the artist either worked out his major compositions or captured noted atmospheric effects with drama and immediacy. And whether Cole learned this technique directly from Constable through teaching or not, he soon started to produce a series of superbly lucid oil sketches, which occupied the remainder of his European tour. This is Thomas Cole's oil sketches I'm showing you now. The Italian Campagna offered him, like generations of other artists, an ideal subject, painting quickly in oils, using a paint box Thomas Cole created luminous and vibrant sketches that provided him with the raw materials for years of finished paintings completed after he returned to New York, to his New York studio years later. And in Italy, he also attended life classes and improved his academic abilities. Cole's journey had taken him far from the rule-breaking works he had made up the Hudson as a naive young painter. But his last major work was to sketch in Florence this panoramic pencil sketch, which he transformed into a meticulous painting, which I think shows that Thomas Cole has ceased to be the American painter of the Catskill Falls and has become schooled in the disciplines of European academic art. Prompted by the illness of his parents, he returned quickly to New York in 1832 and found the country transformed. He was bent upon addressing grand themes suggested to him by his tour and was deeply alarmed by the transformation of the United States under Andrew Jackson, who had been re-elected for a second term just as Cole landed back in the city. Jackson had fueled a market boom, promoting westward's expansion, and he had inaugurated a brutal program of relocation of indigenous peoples. And here we encounter one of those uncanny parallels with the present day. This portrait of Andrew Jackson by Ralph Earl was recently reinstalled in the Oval Office on the day that President Donald Trump signed an executive memorandum to expedite the approval process for the controversial Dakota Access Pipeline. And it appeared again last week, there it is, as Donald Trump met with Navajo citizens and potentially insulted them in front of it. Cole, interestingly, abhorred what he called the Jackson men, and he wrote despairingly, "It appears to me that the moral principle of the nation is much lower than formerly," words we can still share. Jackson's reshaping of America focused Cole's thoughts on a grand artistic scheme, rooted in a Byronic vision of the rise and fall of civilizations, a work that he first conceived in London in 1829, at the heart of the empire into which he had been born. The cycle, which he titled The Course of Empire, would be finished only 6 years later. But already in London, in his sketchbook, he knew that it should commence with a picture of utter wilderness, top left. I'm quoting Cole now. "The human figures should be savages. The second picture should be a sunrise, partially cultivated country, here and there groups of peasants. The third picture should be a noonday scene, a gorgeous city with piles of magnificent architecture, a port crowded with vessels, splendid procession, etc., etc., all that can be combined to show the fullness of prosperity, wealth, and luxury. The fourth should be a stormy battle, the burning of a city, with all concomitant scenes of horror. And the fifth, a sunset, a scene of ruins, rent mountains, and the encroachment of the sea." The patronage of the Manhattan dry goods dealer Luman Reed allowed Cole the money and time to focus on this grand scheme. It was incongruously placed above the fireplace of a domestic home, but it's nonetheless the most public and grandest of statements. The title is taken from Verses on the Prospect of Planting Arts and Learning in America, 1726, a poem by Bishop Berkeley, who appears in John Smibert's The Great Bermuda Group at Yale University Art Gallery. And the text is, of course, "Westward, the course of empire takes its way. The first 4 acts already past, a 5th shall close the drama with the day. Time's noblest offspring is the last. America will be the noblest of the great empires." In Berkeley's poem, the ruin of a decadent Europe is offset by the limitless potential of the American colonies. But in the intervening century, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, Napoleonic Wars, and above all, I think, the turbulent social effects of the Industrial Revolution gave Cole and his contemporaries a vivid sense of history in the making. And I want to present Cole's cycle very briefly here, and it'll be at the conclusion of our exhibition, as the summation and commentary on his Atlantic journeys, a pessimistic self-portrait of white Atlantic imperialism, informed by a Gibbonian vision of Rome, for sure, and that's always been agreed, but with its most immediate referent, which the historiography generally doesn't acknowledge, the history of the British Empire, at this moment the most powerful on earth, yet a society in throes of tumultuous economic and social convulsions that Cole himself had experienced in Bolton. So the course of empire sees Rome after its end, Britain at its height, and as a warning for America in the future. So the savage state is the first of the sequence, the rough, uncultivated landscape, homage to Salvatore Rosa. It introduces the viewer to the landscape that we will follow. So it's this key image here is the hillside, which appears in all 5 canvases. It introduces the hunter-gatherers against which Cole's the hunter-gatherer figures, who are the quote-unquote savages of Cole's notes. But it surely also alludes to America's First Nations, currently being driven westward by Andrew Jackson, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and this is completed in 1836. But of course, it also alludes to the kinds of art that Julia Lum discussed with us yesterday. John Glover's exactly contemporary images of Tasmanian Aboriginal peoples, painted at the very moment that the colonial government was, as Julia pointed out yesterday, involved in a genocidal campaign of violence against them. But for all this, Cole's composition is not a scene of otherness. It's not one of these imperial scenes of alterity, because the single figure of a bowman in the foreground, whose arrow has killed a deer, strikes a noble pose borrowed from the Borghese gladiator, which Cole might have seen in the Louvre in 1831 or copied from a plaster cast. This huntsman in the foreground represents a European ancestor figure. In fact, if you look at the beard, you can see just such people running around Brooklyn and or parts of Hoxton to this day, dressed in similarly bizarre manner. So this is, in fact, an extended cultural self-portrait. It's a portrait of the imperial self. The Arcadian or pastoral state marks the mode of Rosa giving way to that of the beautiful, in homage to the works of Claude, such as the Mill that he'd seen in the National Gallery in London. The landscapes of the Campagna, too, that he'd sketched outside Rome. And it's very interesting thinking about David Matlis's paper yesterday as to whether, in fact, this is the moment of, as it were, Anthropocene transformation that Cole is figuring here. How soon does that take place? This is the moment where human learning is developing. A kind of Pythagorean elder happens to be sketching a theorem in the sand in front of us. Blakean rustics are dancing and singing music, and the visual arts are in their infancy. Rather charmingly, he signs the painting TC underneath this figure of the child just learning to draw. And in the background, religion is starting, not Christianity, but pagan religion, through the only identifiable topographical feature in the whole sequence, of course, Stonehenge, which you see, which of course had featured in James Barrie and William Blake as a keynote of the Romantic imagination. We know all about that from Sam Smiles's great work. Constable, in a visionary late watercolor, which will be shown in our exhibition, painted just after Cole left London, saw the present decay of Stonehenge as a metaphor for Britain's moral and social decline. But Cole sees the temple as an emblem of things to come, a foundation for a future history of architecture and perhaps of darker forces, such as this. And I think this is the key image. This is where the Anthropocene question really enters the entire fable. The cost of human progress is already being noted and logged in many senses in the desecration of nature. The dawn of the Anthropocene is found in the chopping down of trees. Thomas Cole would later angrily disavow what he called the dollar-godded utilitarians who felled the beloved trees he watched in the Catskill Valley and painted. And even more ominous is the presence of a soldier in some sort of Roman attire entering the foreground. Even at the moment of society's infancy, the die is cast in terms of violence and industrialization. And here we have it, Trump Tower. Consummation of Empire is painted on a large... God, this is going out live. Anyway, everyone's asleep in America. Consummation of Empire is painted on a larger canvas than that of the other four works. It's the centerpiece of the series. It represents the vainglorious maturity of a powerful empire. the imperial capital stands astride, it's a port, so it stands astride a great river, estuarian river, with the familiar outline of the mountain seen in all the compositions, only distantly visible now, almost entirely covered. The landscape is covered with marble and gold, although the pot plants are really seriously out of control in this vision. There are references to the Palace Athena and Nike, the kind of emblems that would decorate imperial capitals in the 19th century, as they had in classical antiquity. A noonday sun beats down on an imperial parade with the emperor dressed in red, the vainglorious emperor who brings back his lute, a kind of reference surely to Napoleon here. Inevitably, the seeds of destruction, though, are present at this moment of triumph. The excessive population crowding every balcony and parapet, some of them naked if you get close and look at it, very, very salacious minor detail of Cole's. This implied surely a future catastrophe, a vast sea of people. This invokes the population theories of Thomas Malthus, who in his famous essay of 1798 had predicted mass starvation for Britain if the population growth remained unchecked. The painting also distills Cole's learning from Europe. The composition derives from Claude's Seaport, of course, National Gallery, Turner's Rise of the Carthaginian Empire, which he'd seen in Turner's studio, and that, of course, prefigured the decline of the Carthaginian Empire, a companion piece. Turner had already inaugurated the idea of paired works that equate the inevitable rise and fall of a city with a kind of moral decay at its heart. And Cole's architectural elements are drawn from a range of sources, but it's always seemed to me that the creamy fantasy architecture has more in common with the theatrical neoclassical stucco of Nash's Cumberland Terrace than it does with anything surviving in Rome. That's 1826, only 3 years old when Cole arrived in London. And Cole's Great Waterway, it seems to me, is a response to Constable's The Opening of Waterloo Bridge in 1817, a work begun in 1819 but went through many different forms before it was exhibited in 1832. So it was in Constable's studio probably when Cole visited. Constable's painting celebrates the great institutions of the metropolis, Somerset House, of course, home of the Royal Academy, with the Union Jack, but also includes the shot towers that forcibly remind us of the industrial base that underpinned Britain's economic success. And I think Cole and Constable shared an early ecological consciousness that seems to have prompted a deep pessimism about the irreversibility of this kind of environmental damage. Consummation likewise features a bridge, and it seems to me this might be a part of a sort of parodic reworking of London, in which the vainglorious emperor of Cole is a kind of revisioning of George IV. Cole was actually in London for George IV's funeral in 1830, and in Copley's famous portrait he's, of course, seen wearing red. Surely also with the elephants in the procession, there's a reference to British India, the kind of Durbar processions in which the nabobs of the East India Company were borne aloft on glorious pachyderms. And Cole's vision, too, includes enslaved Africans. The anti-slavery movement was in full force when Cole was in London in 1831. That was the 1831 to 2 was the great Jamaican rebellions reported in the papers in London. And though slavery only ended with compensation to the slave holders in 1838, finally, an event celebrated in Rippingill's print here, that was 2 years after Cole had exhibited these paintings. I think there's and of course in the United States it continued until 3 decades later. There's a distinct sense that slavery is a part of the decadence of empire in this representation. When the series was exhibited in New York, the New York Mirror commented, "Mingled with the triumph of art is the triumph of the conqueror, and with emblems of peace and religion, we see signs of war and the display of pride and vanity. The ostentatious display of riches has succeeded to the efforts of virtuous industry and the study of nature and truth." Well, there were clearly implications for modern America as well as reflections of recent British history. Cole had seen in Bolton the dislocating effects of speculative and unplanned industrialization. He saw the ostentatious wealth of profiteering textile entrepreneurs, and though he had displayed virtuous industry, he saw few rewards. New York, the empire city, was already showing signs of imperial hubris and a pattern of market-driven speculative boom and bust. In Cole's parallel, such excesses must inevitably portend nemesis. And so, in destruction, the city is lost to chaos. A headless Borghese gladiator, again, symbol of violence, overlooks the scene. Cole wrote, "The smoke and flame of prostrate edifices is the key to this work." A recollection, surely, of the burning factories of Bolton in 1811, or the violent riots mounted by the followers of Ned Ludd. Ned Ludd, who, of course, in that print is the Borghese gladiator in calico, something that is worth thinking about. The vortex of swirling clouds in the city as it declines is, of course, referential homage to the great Turner Hannibal. And in the final canvas, Desolation, the ruins of the imperial city recall Rome, a favorite Turnerian and Claudian subject. Cole's work takes on the aspect of an ecological as well as a political parable. And this is interesting in relation to our conversations yesterday. Does he suggest that actually nature can recover from this onslaught? He shows the birds returning and the animals returning to the scene. Humanity is extinct in this vision. And after the pinpoint precision of consummation, his application of paint here has returned to a more generous, natural softness, paying homage to the oil sketches of John Constable. But look again at the composition, and it's one final reworking of the great meditation on decline and ruin, Hadley Castle, that had so impressed Cole in 1829. The onset of democracy for Constable, as for Cole, the rule of the vulgar, has undermined all that is valuable, and Desolation becomes a vision of the future as much as of the past. Later generations would be more specific about this apocalyptic futurology, and I do need a slide for Gustave Doré's New Zealander, contemplating the ruins of London in 1872, John Ames Mitchell's The Last American of 1889, looking at the remains of the Brooklyn Bridge, and of course the classic of all time, the great Planet of the Apes of 1968. This is where we will end up after the cycle of greed, exploitation, Luddism, slavery, imperialism has led us from hubris to nemesis. So the course of empire represents a summation of global journeys rather than a local meditation on American history. By refusing the local and national particularity, it insists that the nation-state is not the key unit for artistic creativity or art historical analysis, rendering such categories as British art and American art defunct. Cole's own identity as the father figure of American landscape painting, with its alleged trajectory towards an enthusiastic endorsement of manifest destiny, seems far from secure. He was, after all, an economic migrant, the victim of cultural and economic forces of displacement over which he had no control. And his love of the American wilderness was tempered by his skepticism about the Jacksonian market economy and the onset of American empires. Cole moved between empires, modern and historical, haunted by recollections of industrial Lancashire, skeptical of contemporary Britain, yet enabled by the lessons he had learned from its artists and collections. And I just want to conclude, and I know my time is up, but I want to conclude with one discovery, which I think in a haunting way actually speaks to the histories that we are now living in. And that was made possible by being at the Met and having the chance to look unframed at the course of empire consummation from the New York Historical Society and the Oxbow. And it's worth saying that when Cole was painting this work in 1836, he realized he couldn't get it finished in time for exhibition, so he laid aside Consummation of Empire and turned to a sketch that he'd made some years earlier of the Connecticut River at Mount Holyoke. He quickly prepared an oil sketch in very much the manner of John Constable that he'd learned in London, and, oh sorry, we've lost that screen anyway. I'll describe this as well as I can. And these paintings were on identical sized canvases next to each other on identical easels in his studio in the spring of 1836 as the ice melted on the Hudson River. But the Met being the Met, we were able to have these objects examined by X-radiography, which showed that underneath the oxbow is this extraordinary, dramatic, gestural painting, so similar to the works, the oil sketches of John Constable. But even more fascinating was the technical examination by Dorothy Mahan, the great conservator at the Met, that revealed in the underdrawing of this area of the oxbow certain lines emerging that do not appear in the final painting. And it became clear on close examination. If you look here, I'm sorry for those of you that can't see this clearly, you can see it in the exhibition, we'll have a representation of this, that is a face that came through very clearly. In fact, it's the face of the caryatid in Consummation of Empire. And it became clear that Cole had abandoned an early version of the great imperial city and painted on top of it the image of the American landscape. So between the paint layers of these two, of this great work, the oxbow, we see the emergence of lines of what would perhaps be understandable as a more industrial or urban city. Beneath the fertile fields of the Republic, harsh, ruled lines seem to prefigure the inevitable future arrival under those arable lands and from within the culture of modern technologies, railways, highways, oil wells, fracking. And this perhaps is the melancholy truth of the Anthropocene, that the whole story has already begun so early that by the time we notice it, it's too late to change it. The lines are coming through the landscape to haunt us. Cole wrote in 1835, just as he was doing this, there are those who regret the improvements of cultivation, that with the improvements of cultivation, the sublimity of the wilderness should pass away. That the scenes of solitude from which the hand of nature has never been lifted, they affect the mind with a more deep-toned emotion than anything that the hand of man has touched. And it seems to me that somehow intuiting its future status as an icon in this painting, the oxbow, that Cole made it a culminating statement of his experience of the white Atlantic as a political and aesthetic unit. And in doing so, we really need both slides, he placed a symbol so vivid and obvious at the middle of this painting that refined intellects such as yours will probably resist. But I am obvious enough to see a bloody great question mark in the middle of this painting. And I think that is why Cole turns to look us in the eye from his Archimedean point in history, drawing on his knowledge, his personal knowledge of the Industrial Revolution. Cole asks the question not just of America and Americans, but of the modern world. How to balance commercial and industrial expansion with the preservation of the environment. In whose interests should the nation be governed? Those of investors and speculators of the present, or those of citizens of the future? America and Britain are both now in the political hands of people that Cole called dollar-godded utilitarians, unable to see beyond self-interest, moving to allow the despoliation of the environment for quick profit, and for many, forcing a move from skilled labor to 0 hours contracts that the Luddites would have recognized. Land and landscape then turn out to be key areas of contestation in late capitalism, as much as in the era of the Industrial Revolution. Politics and aesthetics are profoundly entwined, now as in the era of Andrew Jackson. The President of the United States celebrates the desecration of the wilderness and publicly disrespects those whose hereditary lands his nation appropriated and others whose ancestors it enslaved. And while the British government indulges in deluded nationalism that revives a bankrupt rhetoric of empire, and while British politicians imagine a future in which Britain is a northern Singapore, a low-wage, unregulated dystopia that Ned Ludd would have recognized around him 200 years ago, Cole's question mark is very apropos. It asks us with due romantic pessimism what, if anything, we might do at this late stage to change the course of empire. Thank you. Can you stand? Can you sit down?
Yeah. That was fantastic, Tim. So rich, so impressive. And I wonder whether we can immediately open it out to questions. I've got a number of questions. David, I'll start with you.
Thank you so much. I thought that was fabulous. I really enjoyed it. I want to suggest another dialogue, which is between the course of empire and Barry's progress of human culture and knowledge.
Yeah.
Because Barry starts out with, first scene is Orpheus, is pastoral.
Yes.
Second one, the harvest home, is agricultural, and it's also where you start having the first evidence of conflict. The third is the Lincoln procession, which is all about architecture, and it's got a procession. The fourth then takes you into navigation, and that I think is where there starts to be a kind of departure too.
Right.
But it seems to me that you can't that's part of. I mean, so Barry's story is basically an Enlightenment positive story, which has a kind of happy-ish ending. But what Cole does is he starts from the same. It's the same starting point, but at a later point in history, he's actually in a sense it's a post-Enlightenment. It ends up with a kind of disillusioned ending. So I think that's I don't know. I mean, you could bring those at least the prints into your show, because I think that's the serial nature of the paintings is kind of in response to that. And just one other brief comment.
That's great. Thank you.
The Oxbow, it seems to me, it doesn't go that far. The Oxbow is basically pastoral and agricultural.
Right.
So I don't quite see how. I mean, whereas you seem to be presenting it as kind of pastoral and industrial, and I didn't quite understand. Did I misunderstand something there?
No, but two things. Thank you. First of all, as you would expect from David Salkin, this is absolutely the right point, and I think the relationship with Barry is really, really interesting. So, and thank you for drawing it out so well. And we had considered that, and it is the reason that I didn't include that here was because, as you rightly point out, the trajectory of romantic pessimism is very different from what you find in Barry's cycle. But the idea of a sort of a kind of a history which can be told simultaneously in the classical and the contemporary, which can include both London, the Thames, and these the Olympus and all of that, is very much in Cole's mind. Absolutely, I'm sure, and I'm sure the sequential narration is inspired by seeing those wall paintings. So I think that's a great point. I mean, I think on the other hand, that Cole really did participate in the idea that landscape could replace and displace history painting. So the scale of the figurative elements in relation to the landscape elements is what makes it quite different, that although it's using the same periods in history to make its point and the same kind of arc, or a similar arc up to a point, Cole is really closer to another of your topics, which is Richard Wilson. You know, he's really invested in the historical landscape, displacing the traditions of history painting. So there's a kind of disavowal as well. Yes, exactly. Yes, we did get that one. Yeah, but thank you. But as regards the oxbow, the sort of juxtaposition of a wilderness image and a scene of distinctly modern agriculture. Modern agriculture, not traditional forms of agriculture, so that the passing out of the land is extremely geometric. There are very visible forges and a small-scale workshop. That you see lots of smoke coming up from small-scale. You could call it industrial endeavors. It certainly doesn't show urbanization or modernity in that sense, but nonetheless, it seems to me, I suppose I'm reading it kind of proleptically as a harbinger of that kind of change. But you're absolutely right to say it's not there. What's so fantastic is that it sort of is there underneath, as we discovered with the X-ray. Thank you, yeah.
Matthew?
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, that was great. I was interested if you might be able to say something a little further about Cole's possible contacts with other folks who might count as what Michael Dury has called transatlantic radicals. Yeah. People, and I'm thinking of the painter William Russell Birch, who comes to Philadelphia, quickly accompanied by his cousin, William Russell, who comes with Joseph Priestley. And William Russell Birch is this important landscape painter, landscape designer, translator of the picturesque, enamel painter who claims to have a particular hold through chemical means on the reputation of Reynolds. And he, in London, has trafficked some 500 copies of Paine's Rights of Man. Right. Is there any contact in Philadelphia between someone like Cole with William Russell Birch, who is there in, I think he dies in 1834 or something like this? Is there any information about those kinds of radical networks of displaced Brits or others?
No, I mean, I would love Thomas Cole to be a radical, because then I would have had a different subtitle for my transatlantic radical would have been great. The fact is that Thomas Cole is, he's an old Tory snob. His critique of, so he would be, the only person that he manages to establish, as far as I intuit, and it's not really documented, but with whom he establishes a kind of rapport is John Constable. And so his political sympathies are, as it were, sort of federalist, and he's certainly not circulating in any kind of radical milieu.
I mean, isn't part of your story that we see a kind of change in his perception of what the early United States is, or what it can do?
It is, yes, but I think that comes from a kind of gentlemanly ideal that he shares with people like Daniel Wadsworth and Robert Gilmore, who were his patrons, who were several generations of moneyed, educated, land-owning American establishment figures. So I wish that he were reading more widely. But I mean, it's exactly the same, and this is the dilemma that I think we find in Michael's work on Constable, that here is someone who is creating works which have genuine visual originality, which utilize techniques that we can identify as in many ways radical, in the sense that they displace tradition in significant ways, and yet it's in the service of a political ideology, a critique of empire, which is a critique of, a critique of liberalism. It's a critique of the bourgeois. It's a critique of the industrial, looking back to a golden age of, sort of gentlemanly estate management, which is the way that Cole imagined the world. So I don't think he would have. I mean, the answer is I don't think there is any connection, but also that period in Philadelphia is hardly documented at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. Thanks.
Hamad?
Thank you. That was terrific. But one image that really sort of caught my eye was, I think it's the Catskill Falls,
Yes.
which seemed to be the only vertical orientation in virtually everything that you showed. And I think you used the phrase "no European analog," but that work was screaming Chinese scroll painting to me, both in terms of the imagery it was using, the strokes, even the trees, the way they were drawn, but also that relationship between man and nature. That was very, that modesty of the, particularly the fact that it was the indigenous figure that is modest. And I wonder if, when he was going around, the Dulwich Picture Gallery, he stumbled into somewhere and saw something.
Well, the interesting thing about that picture is that it comes from before the London trip. So he had only really seen art in Philadelphia and New York at that point. But, I think what you're picking up, I love the formal connection that you've made. I think, and it's one of the reasons why that picture is so gorgeous. And I do have to say that picture will not be in our exhibition because it is a private collection of an extremely well-known person who does not want to lend it. But it is a really remarkable object. But in a way that I think the reason it signifies as exceptional is because it breaks all the rules. It's an odd-sized canvas. It's neither horizontal nor vertical. It's sort of squarish. It doesn't allow the eye anywhere to go. It looks bang up against a cliff. Even something like James Ward's Goredale Scar doesn't do quite that. It allows you somewhere to go. So this painting is breaking the rules because I don't think Cole had a secure sense of what the rules are. One of the interesting things about this show is that it could well be argued, and perhaps it will by British critics, that the best paintings are the ones before he came to London, that actually in a way he was most interesting in that regard. So he's certainly breaking rules. I don't know that there's a smoking gun that will put him in the same room as a Chinese scroll painting, but if I find it, I will tell you. Thank you.
Sarah? That's Sarah Monk's there.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to ask you a question about politics.
Mm-hmm.
There are issues to do with the vertical landscape. That there are precedents there in terms of, Turner's work and images of the ruins of Tivoli that are being produced. There are, it does speak to a tradition. But my question is really about what you will do in terms of presenting Cole and current politics. You've given us a kind of perhaps a rather relatable vision of the artist as someone who's pushing back against that kind of Jacksonian, economics and the politics that come with it. And as you've just said, in response to questions, actually that's a Tory, it's a Tory kind of position that Cole exemplifies, which is, kind of ruralising. It's based in pastoralist kind of visions of the landscape. It's anti-imperialist from a perspective which is kind of late 18th, early 19th century, anti-imperialist, which is conservative. And it's environmentalist, and I wonder how you want to present Cole for perhaps particularly British audiences, in this exhibition at a time when you might argue that that very vision of the landscape is what's put us in this place, that it's a planterocracy kind of. Politics, which is very happy actually to turn and deny, commerce whilst also, reaping the benefits of it, that is deploying exactly those kinds of tropes. So, how to frame Cole properly, actually, in terms of what he's really doing.
Yes, a good question. And it's, of course, easy to agree with Cole that there are certain things wrong with empire. It is, however, not the point of the exhibition to endorse Cole's vision of the world, right? And it certainly doesn't do so. The spin that I have placed on it is not necessarily the spin that the exhibition will place on this, partly because that's a collective enterprise, and it's authored not by an individual, by an institution, which has rather deeper roots in the. Well, it'll be very interesting to see who writes the labels at the National Gallery. Actually, I don't know. The institution does the labels, so they choose what to say. We lose control of it at that point. At the Met, the labels attempt to take on an extremely powerful myth, which is the myth of the Hudson River School. And that's one big target for an exhibition in the very institution that invented the Hudson River School. So, there's only so much one can do with 60 oil paintings, and I do feel like problematizing nationalism in relation to visual culture is actually a genuinely important thing to do. The second thing is to say that landscape painting problematizes the relationship between politics and aesthetics over the terrain of the natural world. And that, again, is something which is normally naturalized in the setting of art historical display. So those are two pretty big targets, but also, the other thing to say is that there's the idea of coal as an economic migrant is actually a really important political statement to make in New York at this particular moment. The idea that he's someone who didn't have a choice as to what his destiny was. He didn't choose to come to America. He had to go to America because they were bankrupt, and that was their last throw of the dice. That also is a very, very powerful political point to make and controversial at this moment. However, what I do not want to say is let's all go back to living in Daniel Wadsworth's Montevideo, which is what Cole wanted us to do. Any more than in exhibiting any historical figure, you necessarily endorse their solutions to, or going to a Wagner opera. I mean, it's so what we want to do is position him historically and problematize him and draw out from his work some of the key issues which link it to the present moment. I think in Britain, it's really different because he's actually, very, very easy to position politically in Britain. He's very difficult to position politically in America.
It's an interesting problem about
Yeah.
to do with, much of what we've been talking about
Right.
And hearing about yesterday, essentially it's to do with the environment.
Yeah.
And the politics that come with that,
Right.
they are very, wide-ranging
Yeah.
and nuanced, actually, in their
Yeah.
quality. And so, that relationship between conservatism and environmentalism that you're kind of holding out there, I think, is an interesting.
It is interesting. I think there's all just to make. I know there are other questions, but just to make another point, there is also at the moment there is a distinct connection between coal, church, early photography, and the founding of the national parks, which are under immediate danger of destruction at this moment. So I'm prepared to forego a little collusion with Toryism if anyone thinks it's worth saving a national park as a result of this. It's a strategic withdrawal on the subject of, a kind of class view of the world from coal in order to make these other points that I've talked about.
Mark, can you just wait for the microphone?
Thank you very much, Tim. That was a tour de force, truly. And in addition to the detail that you provided so richly and so persuasively, I was also very taken with the large historiographical frame that you set up, particularly at the beginning. So I wonder if I could ask you, quite seriously actually, to speculate on what we might call the course of the empire of art history. Which I think you're doing here. And while I don't want to defend the construction of the Hudson River School, for example, and applaud your inroads in that direction, I wonder if there has been a long project of affirmative action, we might call it, in the history of American art, the history of other national groups. And if you think we are actually moving away from those paradigms, and if we should move away from those paradigms towards something like global landscape, which I think I picked up that title as the future. If so, if we are going in that direction, which I think many of us really want to go, what happens to Centers for British Art? Just to choose a random example.
Well, what happens to Centres for British Art is that you appoint an Americanist as the director, and then they do really interesting exhibitions for 15 years. So I mean, I think one of the dangers of the Englishness of English arts construct, which is it produced many splendors, is that it's rooted in 19th century racial theory, and in the end, still one of the best single author, or one of the most comprehensive single author books on British art was published in Berlin in 1942, right, Dagobert Frey, with the obvious idea that this constitutes a totality which can be identified and understood and then invaded and assimilated. So anything that breaks down those ideas is good, but it doesn't mean that, by looking at Cole as someone who passes between places and across borders and exists in a circulatory system, that doesn't mean that I deny the existence of, I use the word British and American all the time. The whole thing was based on, in fact, a comparative study of these two quite different places. So I think the answer is that places like the Paul Mellon Centre have, in fact, moved away from the we're not giving a grant to that because it's not British enough paradigm, which was a sort of founding principle of the centre 40 or 50 years ago when it was doing different things, and it's moved and changed, and I think that's all of a good thing. I mean, there are artists who are just British artists and don't ever engage with anything else, and I think we should write books about them too. So it's not a sort of exclusionary. I mean, the danger is that you have a new canon, and that the only artists that you now look at are kind of border-crossing, marginal people, and I think that would be a sort of ridiculous gesture. It's got to be additive rather than a kind of replacement. But thank you for the question, Mark.
I think we have to draw it to a close there. But can I ask you all to thank Tim once again for a really amazing paper?
Thank you.